The 4th of May might seem just a day like any other, but in the internal life of the monastic family that I was in for many years in my youth in France, it was actually a big day, because it was the day when we celebrated those who were the beginning of the martyrs of the Reformation. They were the Carthusians. So I'll give you in a few words some kind of overview of what was going on and why. As you know, the king had a problem. He wanted a male heir, and he was going to get one. The result was that attempted queen after queen came along. Eventually he got his heir, a male, Edward, who was a weak child and didn't survive very long, but just enough to reign. And while officially king, it was his tutors, Latimer and Ridley, who were actually pulling the strings. And that was what was going to bring in Protestantism eventually as we know it. But that was down the line. What was happening initially was still within the framework of the Catholic Church. It was this little bit of independence, breaking away from Rome, that wouldn't allow a divorce, that was going to make all the rest possible. Because he was king and had an awful lot of power, people were afraid. And they knew what he could do, so they kept their heads down. Actually, very few realized all the implications. Essentially, men of prayer, like the Carthusian martyrs that we're feasting today, and great exceptions like Thomas More, Lord Chancellor of England, a layman, but after the king the most powerful person in the country, and one bishop only, St. John Fisher of Rochester, who saw clearly what was down the line if this happened. One day, the Carthusians were all together, the important ones, priors, in the London Charterhouse. They wanted to know what to do with regard to what they were pressing them to do, sign away certain things. What did they do? They decided to bombard heaven for light. They decided to celebrate a solemn Mass in honour of the Holy Spirit, and so in red they began the chant. During the celebration, something strange happened. A shiver came upon them, and they saw in the air something which sent a shiver down their spine. They saw something very similar to what was seen on the Feast of Pentecost. Red in the air, as it were, burning flames in the shape of tongues, hovering above them at the altar. They realized that God was involved in what was happening in England, and that they, perhaps, were a part of it. It could go either way. The message was so strong that they refused to compromise. And so, they were the first. Because it was against the king, they were guilty of high treason. That means you're betraying the king. Therefore it's a political crime. And whereas the punishment for being a witch or something was that of burning, that of being a traitor against the king was that of being hanged and then taken down while still alive, just about, resuscitated, then opened up, drawn they called it, and all the organs brought out one by one. And the last organ would be the heart. And in the ritual, the executioner would hold up the heart, and it was still beating, and he would say, "Behold the heart of a traitor." And they would expect it to reply, "Long live the king." And then, eventually, the body was quartered, chopped up. They were the first, 1535. Who was the last? Do you know? Who is your local saint here?
Oliver Blanchard.
Exactly. And that was as late as the beginning of the 80s of the next century. And in between, dozens and dozens and dozens of holy priests. Often in hidey holes, sought out under extreme duress, because there was a genius of a lay brother, a Jesuit lay brother called Brother Little John, who was brilliant at creating invisible hidey holes, in which, when they knew there was somebody coming, a priest would disappear and crouch for hours, indeed even days on end. And so it was that they tried and they tried to keep the light of the true sacraments alive in England. Now, it's kind of important to remember this, because in a Catholic land like Ireland, we also had the same heroic sanctity and resistance. Only there it was massive. The whole people were faithful. And it was a thorn in the flesh of the English monarchs all along. Why am I bringing up this today? Well, does it not make one reflect that when, in the face of all this torture and fidelity, things were resisted? Right now, the descendants of those who resisted under pressure, torture, dungeon and rack are themselves wanting that we voted away the rights of God and of His Church over this land. It's not just human. It's not just social. It's not just political. It's, let's say it, demonic. God, once He's put out of the equation, has His hands tied with regard to blessing a land. Do you think that if we vote this in, Ireland will also reap the consequences? I'm telling you, if we put God aside, we ourselves are our own worst